Hello everyone, welcome to chapter 9. We are actually in week 9 and we are going to actually talk about security management practices in this chapter. So basically what we are going to talk in this chapter, we are going to talk about benchmarking, we are going to talk about different standards and how our organization measure them, we are going to talk about best practices. Also we are going to talk about information security performance management program, and as well as how to basically collect information security management measurements, and also we will look at a template, the NIST template, which is SP 800-55. So let's look at some of the learning objectives here. So at the end of this chapter, you should be able to list the key elements of key information security management practices. Also, you should be able to describe the components of a security performance measurement program, as well as you should be able to identify some of the strategies that are suitable for implementing a security performance measurement program. At the end, we will talk about some of the emerging trends in terms of getting your certification and accreditation of the information technology systems. Basically, organizations, they are trying to deliver the most value with a given level of investment, and this is basically called value proposition. So the companies, they are trying to develop and use a repeatable information security management practices, and by doing that, it can bring the organization closer to basically meet their objective that they're supposed to meet. One of those things that a lot of organizations do, and maybe there are other methods too, but one of them include using basically benchmarks. Another one is baseline. So let's look at what is a benchmark. Basically, companies, they usually generate a security blueprint by drawing from some of those established security security models of frameworks. So as we said, we need to first, like an architect, set a blueprint for our program. Another way to create this blueprint is basically to look at the path that is taken by other organizations and see what they have developed, and then they should also adopt that. By using this method, which we call this method benchmarking, we can compare our organization effort to those other companies that we feel they are kind of similar in the size, in the industry, and as well as the structure of our organization. Benchmarking can also help determine which controls should be considered, but it shouldn't determine how these controls should be implemented. So we're not gonna look at the way how to do it, but we are going to determine that what controls they have put in place, but then we adopt our own way to implement that in our organization. Also, some companies, they use this as an internal tool to basically compare the current performance of the organization against the past performance, and basically look at some ways that they can improve those areas, and if they need to adopt a new set of criteria, maybe they should do that. If they need to change a process, maybe they can do that. So in the information security, there are basically two categories of benchmark that are being used. One of them is the standards of due care, or basically due diligence. The other one is basically recommended practices, or sometimes we might call it best security practices. Best security practices can include a subcategory of practices, which is called golden standards. But they are basically regarded in the organization as the best of the best. So basically the best of the best, you can call it that golden standard. Now let's look at the standard of due care or due diligence. Basically, for legal reasons, some organization may be compelled to adopt a minimum level of security. As to establish a future legal defense, they may need to verify that they have done what any prudent organization would do in similar situation. This is known as a standard of basically due care or due diligence. In due diligence, it requires that organization making sure that the implemented standards continue to provide the required level of protection that the company needs. Companies should make sure that they have met a reasonable level of security in all kinds of area of the security in the organization. And basically they have adequately protected all those information assets that the company has before making effort to improve kind of individual areas to meet the higher standards. So that means like maybe some companies, they want to implement some kind of advanced controls that is available to them, but because of some financial or personal reasons, they can't do that. So they have to basically establish, they cannot just establish a costly state-of-art security in one area and then don't do anything in other areas. So that's why they should kind of making sure that they have a reasonable level of security in all areas. So now let's look at the recommended security practices. Some security efforts that try to provide a superior level of performance in the protection of information are basically called recommended practices. So security efforts that are considered among the best in the industry, they are being called best security practices or BSPS. So sometimes we use them interchangeably to be able to say, okay, maybe the best security practices or recommended security practices. The best security practices basically balance the need for information access with the need of adequate protection while demonstrating physical responsibility. The companies with best practices may not have the practices that are best in every area. They may only have established a high quality in one area, maybe of the organization. But we need to keep this in mind that the well-managed security programs, they understand that the requirement that minimum quality standards are basically needed for the protection of all information assets in the organization. By saying that the federal government also maintains a website that allows government agencies to be able to share their recommended security practices with other agencies and also public. You can find that on the NIST website, or if you go to the page 366 of your book, you should be able to find the website. So they try to do this because they wanted to kind of identify and evaluate the recommended practices for computer information protection and security across the U.S. federal information system landscape. So this site, basically they have developed it in the August of 2015 and is now considered historical information. For those companies, they can go and look at the best security practices that are out there. Now let's look at about selecting the recommended practices. Industries that are regulated by law and standards and are subject to government or industry oversight are required to meet regularity or basically industrial guidelines in their security practices. For the other organization and government and industry guidelines can serve as excellent source of information. about what is required to control the information security risk in the company. When we want to choose the best recommended practices for our organization, there are certain questions that come in mind. One of them is, does your organization resemble the identified target organization of the recommended practices? That's important because you want to get the only relevant. It's going to be relevant if your organization has basically has a similar structure or is similar to that organization that have that standard. And then the second question maybe you can keep in mind is, are you in a similar industry as target of the recommended practices? So maybe a strategy that works in manufacturing sector, it might not work for a nonprofit organization or a retail sector. And another question could be, do you face similar challenges as the target of the recommended practices? So basically, a recommended practice that assume that such a program is in place is not likely to be applicable for your organization. Is your organization structure similar to the target? Again, you need to look at it in terms of, does it have a similar structure? And, otherwise maybe it's not best suitable for you. And then another one is, are there resources you can expense similar to those called by the recommended practices as well? So a recommended practice that demands funding beyond what your organization can afford doesn't have any value to you, to your organization basically. And then, are you in a similar threat environment as the one assumed by the recommended practices as well? So, you want to make sure that those recommended practices that are years or even months old may not answer the current threat environment that your company has. So sometimes we might consider those recommended practices obsolete after 5 years. So it's not a good thing to use that. Now let's look at limitation to benchmarking and recommended practices. Sometimes one of the biggest problems with benchmarking is that many organizations, they don't share the result with other companies. So if an attack happens to the organization, they perceive it as a failure, and normally they keep it secret. So, we don't know any results of if those best practices at work. An increasing number of security administrators, basically they're joining professional association society, such as the ISSA and ISACA, and they are basically sharing their stories and lessons learned to overcome this barrier that a lot of companies have, because a lot of times we don't share our information. So it's always good to do that, and the security administrator, if they go to these places, they can basically share their experiences. Also, sometimes you might find security journals that they have talked about some organization and they talked about their attack. So that's another alternative to kind of look at some of the lessons learned in the security journals as well. Another barrier to benchmarking is that the two organizations might not be identical. Organizations that offer product or service in the same market may be different dramatically in size, composition, in their philosophy, in their culture, even in terms of their technological infrastructure, and as well as the way that they want to plan to expand their security practices. Another problem with benchmarking is that recommended practices are a moving target. What does that mean? That means knowing what happened a few years ago, which is typical in benchmarking, it doesn't necessarily tells you what to do next. So a security program, they should kind of look at the new threat as well as the method, techniques, also some guidelines and training approaches, and to be able to combat them. And of course, some new technologies that are out there to be able to combat those threats. So this is it for this part. In the next video, we will talk about baselining.